New York City, November 1969. The Vietnam War is killing 400 Americans a week. Back home, Harlem is dying slower. No headlines, no body counts. Just the quiet arithmetic of poverty, abandonment, and a new product moving through the neighborhood with a purity nobody had seen before. In a booth at the back of a diner on Lenox Avenue, two men are meeting. One is Frank Lucas, 40 years old. Compact, still, watchful. He is drinking coffee he hasn't touched. In front of him, a yellow legal pad, a pen, and a problem. The problem is this: he has found the product. He has the source in Southeast Asia, the connection that gives him heroin of extraordinary purity at prices no competitor can match. He has the money to buy it. What he does not yet have, what stands between him and the largest illegal operation in American history, is the answer to a single logistical question. How do you move hundreds of kilos of heroin from Southeast Asia to New York City without anyone stopping you? The man across the booth has spent 4 years in Vietnam thinking about a different version of this exact problem. His name, for the purposes of this story, is the man Frank Lucas called the General. A former Green Beret. A man who had spent his military career solving the most complex supply chain problem in the world. How do you move men, weapons, fuel, food, medicine, and intelligence across a war zone, through hostile territory, past people who are actively trying to stop you, reliably, repeatedly, at scale? The General slides a folded map across the table. Frank Lucas unfolds it, studies it for a long moment. Then he picks up his pen and starts writing. What gets written on that legal pad over the next 3 hours will become the operational blueprint of an empire that, at its peak, moves an estimated $1 million per day through the streets of American cities. It is not a criminal plan. It is a military logistics plan, applied to crime, and the most devastating thing about it, the thing that will take the DEA years to understand and longer to admit, is that Frank Lucas didn't invent this approach. He learned it from the United States Army. To understand what Frank Lucas took from the military, you first need to understand what the military had built in Southeast Asia by 1969. The United States military presence in Vietnam was, by any measure, one of the most complex logistical operations in human history. At its peak, the U.S. military was maintaining over 500,000 troops in a country on the other side of the world. Those troops required everything: food, water, ammunition, weapons, vehicles, fuel, medical supplies, communications equipment, spare parts for equipment of every kind. They required this constantly, reliably, in enormous quantities, across a geography that was actively hostile: jungle, mountain, river delta, contested coastline. The Defense Logistics Agency, the Military Airlift Command, the Naval Supply Systems Command, the apparatus that sustained American military operations in Vietnam, was a bureaucratic and logistical masterpiece, even as the military strategy it served was failing catastrophically. The numbers are instructive. By 1969, the U.S. military was moving approximately 800,000 short tons of cargo per month into Vietnam. This included everything from aircraft parts to cigarettes, from artillery shells to refrigerated food. The supply chain ran from manufacturing facilities in the continental United States through intermediate depots in Japan, the Philippines, and Guam, to ports in Da Nang and Saigon, and from there to forward operating bases throughout the country. This infrastructure required an enormous workforce: quartermasters, logistics officers, transportation specialists, port workers, warehouse managers, customs officials, air traffic controllers. Tens of thousands of people whose job was to move things from one place to another reliably at scale. And within this enormous, complex, bureaucratically managed system, something else was moving: heroin. By 1969, the CIA was aware, and would later be forced to acknowledge, that the same infrastructure that was supplying American troops was being used by various actors to move heroin out of the Golden Triangle and into channels that eventually reached American streets. The mechanisms were multiple: corrupt military personnel who allowed shipments to move through official channels, civilian contractors who exploited their access to military logistics networks, and a general environment in which the sheer volume of material moving in and out of Southeast Asia made comprehensive oversight impossible. This was not a secret exactly. There were congressional investigations. There were journalists pursuing the story. There were DEA agents in Southeast Asia who were filing reports that, when they reached certain desks in Washington, had a way of disappearing into bureaucratic silence. Frank Lucas was not reading congressional reports or DEA memos, but he was in Southeast Asia. He was talking to people. He was watching. And what he saw was this. The most powerful military on Earth had built a supply chain that moved material across the Pacific Ocean at enormous scale with extraordinary reliability. Protected by military authority, customs arrangements, and sheer bureaucratic complexity from the kind of scrutiny that would have exposed a civilian operation immediately. He saw a highway. He needed to find an on-ramp. The meeting with the general in the Lenox Avenue diner was not Frank Lucas's first encounter with military thinking. Frank Lucas had grown up in a world where military discipline was one of the few forms of organizational excellence available to black men. He had watched men in his neighborhood who had served, in World War II and Korea, bring back not just their trauma, but their training. The ability to think operationally, to plan, to execute, to maintain discipline under pressure, to understand hierarchy and chain of command. Bumpy Johnson, his mentor, had run his operation with military-adjacent discipline, clear chains of command, strict operational security, defined roles and responsibilities. Frank had absorbed this model and refined it. But the general brought something different. Formal military logistics doctrine. The specific, systematized approach to supply chain management that the U.S. Army had developed over decades and refined, at enormous cost and with enormous sophistication, in the specific context of Southeast Asian operations. The general was not offering Frank Lucas access to military infrastructure. That is a myth, or at least an oversimplification, that various accounts have perpetuated. What the general was offering was something more fundamental, a way of thinking about the problem. Military logistics doctrine, stripped to its essentials, addresses several core challenges that Frank Lucas's operation faced in identical form. The problem of scale. Military logistics doesn't move small quantities. It moves the quantities that sustained operations require, repeatedly, reliably over time. Frank needed to think not about moving a single large shipment, but about building a system that could move product continuously, at the volume the market demanded. The problem of interdiction. Military logistics operates in environments where hostile actors are actively trying to stop the supply chain. The solution is not to find a single perfect route, but to build redundancy, multiple routes, multiple methods, multiple intermediaries, so that the interdiction of any single element does not collapse the entire system. The problem of last-mile distribution. Military logistics can move material from the United States to Vietnam, but getting it from the port in Da Nang to the individual soldier in a forward operating base requires a completely different kind of infrastructure. Frank's problem was identical. Getting product from the import point in New York to the individual street-level dealer in Harlem, Newark, Baltimore, and beyond. The problem of personnel management. A military operation requires people who follow orders, maintain operational security, perform their functions reliably, and can be replaced when they fail or are lost. Frank's Country Boys operation faced the same requirements. The general walked Frank through each of these problems using the frameworks he had learned in Special Forces training and refined in 4 years of Vietnam operations. He drew diagrams. He used military terminology, lines of communication, forward operating bases, redundant supply routes, that Frank translated as the general spoke into the specific language of his operation. The yellow legal pad filled up. What emerged was not a plan for a single drug shipment. It was the architecture of an organization, a permanent, self-sustaining, operationally resilient system for moving product from source to market continuously and at scale. The core insights were 3. First, never depend on a single route or method. Military logistics uses multiple lines of communication precisely because any single line can be cut. Frank Lucas, applying this principle, would never rely on a single transportation method or a single set of couriers. The specific mechanisms he used, and accounts differ on the precise details, which is itself evidence of operational security working as designed, involved multiple methods, multiple intermediaries, multiple points of entry into the United States. Second, build the organization like a military unit, not a criminal gang. A gang is held together by personal loyalty, fear, and informal understanding. It is inherently fragile. It depends on the specific individuals involved, their relationships, their continued willingness to participate. A military unit is held together by structure, training, defined roles, and institutional identity that survives the loss of individual members. Frank Lucas's country boys were not a gang. They were an operational unit, recruited, trained, organized, and managed according to principles that would have been recognizable to any military officer. Third, operational security is not a feature, it is the foundation. Military operations fail when information about them reaches the enemy. Criminal operations fail when information about them reaches law enforcement. The solution in both cases is the same: compartmentalization. Each person knows only what they need to know to perform their function. No single person, except the commander, holds the complete picture. Frank Lucas applied this principle with a rigor that consistently frustrated DEA investigators. Informants could describe their piece of the operation. They could not describe the whole because they didn't know the whole. These were not Frank Lucas's original insights. They were codified military doctrine, adapted to a new operational context. This is what the general sold across that booth in the Lenox Avenue diner. Not access, not connections, not a specific smuggling route. A way of thinking. Watch how the doctrine plays out in practice. By 1970, Frank Lucas's operation had the characteristics of a small military organization more than a criminal enterprise in the conventional sense. The country boys, the North Carolina relatives and childhood connections who formed his distribution network, were recruited the way special operations units are recruited, for reliability, discretion, and personal loyalty to the commander, rather than for existing criminal credentials or street reputation. They were men who had no criminal history, which meant no existing relationships with law enforcement, no habits that could be exploited, no criminal infrastructure that could be penetrated. They were trained, not formally, not in any classroom, but in the specific, operational sense of being given clear procedures, clear expectations, clear standards of performance. Frank Lucas did not tolerate improvisation in the operational elements of his business. Each role had a defined way of being executed. Deviation from the procedure was not an expression of initiative. It was a failure. They were organized in cells, small groups with defined functions and limited knowledge of the larger structure. A distributor in Newark knew his supplier and his customers. He did not know the import mechanism, the financial structure, the Southeast Asian sourcing, or the other distributors in the network. If he was arrested and talked, and some eventually did, what he could give law enforcement was limited to his cell. This compartmentalization was not perfect. No compartmentalization is. But it forced law enforcement to work harder, to build cases piece by piece rather than collapsing the whole structure through a single arrested informant. The financial management followed similar principles. Frank Lucas's operation generated enormous cash flows that needed to be managed, laundered, and deployed without creating the kind of financial paper trail that federal investigators could follow. The specific mechanisms he used are a matter of some historical dispute. Frank Lucas has been characteristically imprecise about the details in his public accounts. But the operational principle was clear. The money moved through multiple channels, multiple intermediaries, multiple jurisdictions, in amounts and through mechanisms designed to resist pattern recognition. The import mechanism, the specific means by which product moved from Southeast Asia to the United States, is the element of Frank Lucas's operation that has attracted the most myth and the most controversy. Various accounts, including some of Frank Lucas's own statements over the years, have described mechanisms involving military personnel and military transportation infrastructure. The specific claim about soldiers' coffins, the idea that heroin was concealed in the body bags or caskets of American soldiers killed in Vietnam, has become one of the most persistent elements of the Frank Lucas legend. The reality, as best as can be reconstructed from available evidence, is more complex and in some ways more disturbing than the specific claim. There is substantial evidence that the military logistics infrastructure in Vietnam was compromised by drug trafficking, not necessarily through the specific mechanism of coffins, but through the general exploitation of military transportation and customs arrangements by corrupt personnel. This was not primarily Frank Lucas's operation. It was a broader phenomenon, documented in various investigations, that reflected the general corruption of the Southeast Asian military environment. Frank Lucas's operation exploited this environment. How precisely, Which specific mechanisms, which specific arrangements, remains partially obscured by operational security that apparently held even through his cooperation with federal authorities. What is clear is that product of extraordinary purity moved from Southeast Asia to New York in quantity sufficient to supply the most significant heroin distribution operation in American history. The military logistics doctrine the general had outlined in that Lenox Avenue diner worked. By 1971, the DEA's Special Investigations Unit had identified Frank Lucas as a significant target. This identification was itself an achievement. Frank Lucas's operational security, the compartmentalization, the personal invisibility, the lack of the conventional criminal profile that law enforcement was trained to recognize, had kept him off the radar for years longer than a conventional criminal operation would have managed. When they finally focused on him, the investigators faced a problem that military commanders have faced for centuries when trying to penetrate a well-organized adversary. They could see the effects of the operation but not its structure. They could observe the product on the streets, could trace its extraordinary purity as a signature, could document the distribution network's reach and efficiency. But the organization that produced these effects was, by design, difficult to see. The DEA's approach was methodical. Build from the outside in. Arrest and flip street-level dealers to identify mid-level distributors. Arrest and flip mid-level distributors to identify the upper levels of the network. Accumulate information until the picture of the whole organization emerged. This approach worked, eventually. But it was slow, partial, and repeatedly frustrated by the compartmentalization that Frank Lucas had built into the organization from its inception. The specific interdiction challenge that Frank Lucas's military-derived logistics doctrine created for law enforcement was this. In a conventional criminal organization, disrupting a single major element, the primary supply route, a key financial intermediary, a top lieutenant, produces cascading failures throughout the structure. The organization is brittle because its elements are tightly coupled. Frank Lucas's organization was not brittle. It had been designed for resilience. The multiple supply routes meant that interdicting one did not collapse the whole. The cellular distribution structure meant that rolling up one cell did not reveal the others. The financial management meant that tracking the money was difficult even for investigators with sophisticated financial analysis tools. The DEA was, in essence, fighting a guerrilla war with conventional tactics. The analogy is not casual. The same doctrinal challenge that the U.S. military was failing to resolve in Vietnam. How do you defeat an adversary who doesn't fight by your rules? Who doesn't present the concentrated targets your firepower is designed to destroy? Who uses the terrain and population against you? Was being played out in miniature on the streets of Harlem. Frank Lucas had, consciously or not, imported not just the logistics doctrine, but also the asymmetric warfare logic of the Vietnam theater. He understood, at an intuitive if not academic level, that the DEA's institutional strengths, concentrated investigative resources, legal authority, financial analysis capability, were most effective against organizations that matched their expectations. An organization that didn't match their expectations was harder to fight. What finally gave the DEA traction was the one element of Frank Lucas's operation that was not militarily disciplined, Frank Lucas himself. The chinchilla coat at the Super Bowl. The visible wedding. The gradual accumulation of the visible lifestyle that the invisible man had spent years denying himself. Military doctrine has a concept for this. The commander's critical vulnerability. Every commander, however disciplined, has a point of vulnerability that, if exploited by the adversary, can collapse an otherwise resilient operation. For Frank Lucas, the critical vulnerability was human. The need, after years of extraordinary discipline, to be seen. To exist visibly in the world he had built. The DEA exploited it. The military analogy has one fundamental limit. Wars have enemies. The casualties of war, however terrible, are distributed between combatants who have, in some sense, entered a conflict. Frank Lucas's war had no enemy combatants. The casualties were civilians, the people who died from blue magic, who were destroyed by addiction, who lost sons and daughters and brothers and sisters to the product that moved through Frank Lucas's military precision supply chain. These people had not entered any conflict. They were not participants in the struggle between Frank Lucas and the DEA, between Frank Lucas and the Italian mob, between Frank Lucas and anyone. They were the market. In military logistics, the end user of the supply chain is the soldier who needs the ammunition or the food or the medicine to survive and fight. The supply chain exists to serve that person. In Frank Lucas's operation, the end user of the supply chain was the addict who needed the next hit to manage the dependency that the product had created. The supply chain existed to extract money from that person's desperation. The efficiency of the logistics, the extraordinary purity of the product, the reliable availability, the price point, was not in service of the end user. It was in service of the extraction. The military analogy breaks down here, and it breaks down in a way that illuminates something essential about the moral architecture of Frank Lucas's operation. Frank Lucas was a brilliant organizational thinker. He identified a problem, how to move product from source to market efficiently and at scale, and solved it with tools and concepts that were genuinely sophisticated. The adaptation of military logistics doctrine to criminal enterprise was, by any operational measure, a masterpiece. But the operation he was running was not a supply chain for something neutral. It was a supply chain for a product that created its own demand by destroying the autonomy of its users. The efficiency of the logistics made the destruction more efficient. The purity of the product made the addiction more complete. The scale of the operation made the devastation more extensive. The general, sitting across the booth in that Lenox Avenue diner, was selling operational doctrine. He may or may not have thought carefully about what it would be used for. Military men are trained to solve operational problems. The moral dimension of the application is somebody else's department. Frank Lucas was thinking about the operational problem. He was very good at thinking about operational problems. Harlem paid for the solution. By 1973, heroin addiction in the neighborhoods where blue magic circulated was at levels that community organizations, social workers, and the church, always the church, the institution that actually counted the cost, described as catastrophic. Families were being hollowed out. Young men who might have been the next generation of community leadership were instead dying in their 20s from overdoses of extraordinarily pure heroin, or surviving the addiction in states that left them permanently diminished. The supply chain was working perfectly. That was the problem. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975. When federal investigators eventually reconstructed the full scope of his operation, the sourcing, the transportation, the distribution network, the financial flows, what they found was not what they expected to find. They expected a criminal enterprise. They found an organization. The distinction matters. A criminal enterprise is opportunistic, personality-dependent, structurally fragile. An organization has systems, procedures, redundancies, and the capacity to survive the loss of individual members. What Frank Lucas had built was, by the standards of what law enforcement was accustomed to dealing with, something closer to an organization. The DA's after-action analysis of the Frank Lucas operation became, in internal circles, something of a training document, not for how to build a drug operation, but for what a sophisticated criminal organization looked like, how it functioned, and what investigative approaches could and could not penetrate it. The military doctrine that the general had outlined in a Lenox Avenue diner in 1969 had been stress-tested against the full resources of federal law enforcement for 6 years before it finally broke. That is an extraordinary run for any criminal operation. It reflects the genuine operational sophistication of the blueprint. The deeper legacy is more troubling. Frank Lucas was not the last person to apply military logistics doctrine to criminal enterprise. The organizational principles he used, cellular structure, compartmentalization, redundant supply routes, disciplined personnel management, financial opacity, became templates that subsequent operators studied and adapted. The drug organizations that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly the Colombian cartels that transformed the cocaine trade, operated on principles that were, in many respects, refinements of the same basic approach. Frank Lucas did not invent the militarized criminal organization, but he demonstrated, with brutal operational clarity, that the approach worked. That you could take the organizational tools the military had developed to project power across the world and apply them to the projection of a different kind of power across American cities. The military had built the tools for a purpose. Frank Lucas had found another purpose for them. And Harlem, once again, was where the experiment was conducted. The general sat across a booth on Lenox Avenue and drew a map. Frank Lucas took the map and built an empire. Neither of them, in that November evening in 1969, was counting the people who would die so the map could work. That accounting, as always, was left to someone else. To the mothers. To the church. To the neighborhood that absorbed the experiment and paid its costs and is still, in some ways, paying them now. The blueprint was brilliant. The blueprint was devastating. Both of these things are true. That is the story of Frank Lucas. That is always the story of Frank Lucas.